Hi, I'm Mary Harvey, Associate Provost for Program Development here at the university, and I admire you all. It's hot in this room. I just want to say to you that it's worth a little perspiration for the opportunity to spend some time with Nancy Hopkins. I am very pleased to welcome you all to the inaugural colloquium on how to advance women in science and engineering. We are very proud to launch this annual event with remarks and inspiration from Nancy Hopkins, a scientist who has done so much over so many years to promote equality of opportunity for women in STEM disciplines. The idea for this colloquium was developed by the planning group of the Women in Science Project, a 2-year-old collaboration of faculty from the biological, physical, and social sciences divisions and the provost's office. The project aims to bring women faculty together to share their work, make connections around common research interests, and build community that extends beyond their departments and their laboratories. The members of the planning group include Margaret Gardell, Leslie Kay, Karen Kim, Kai Lee, Kay McLeod, Linda Zarilli, and myself. In addition to her presentation today, over the course of Nancy's visit, she's going to be meeting in small group sessions with deans and faculty from the Biological Sciences Division, Physical Sciences Division, and Social Sciences Division, and with the Deputy Director of Fermilab. She had lunch today with graduate students and postdoctoral researchers from our campus, and I hear it was quite the rousing lunch. She will deliver a paper on her current research to colleagues in the biological sciences tomorrow. Many sponsors have contributed time and treasure to making this visit by our distinguished speaker possible. I'd like to recognize all of them. The Division of the Biological Sciences, Ben May Department for Cancer Research, with special thanks to Marcia Rosner, because Nancy wouldn't be here were it not for Marcia. The University of Chicago Comprehensive Cancer Center, the Division of the Physical Sciences, the Materials Research Science and Engineering Center, the Computation Institute, the Center for Gender Studies, the Division of the Social Sciences, the Institute for Mind and Biology, the college, the Office of the Vice President for Research and for National Laboratories, and the Office of the Provost. Without all of their support, this visit wouldn't be happening. Thank you to all our sponsors. To introduce our speaker, I turn to Kay McLeod, faculty member in the Ben May Department for Cancer Research, who has worked tirelessly to ensure the success of this event. Kay?
Thank you, Mary. It is indeed an honor to welcome Nancy. She is the Amgen Professor of Biology at MIT. Her scientific achievements are, in many ways, when I reminded myself of all of them, I realized that they are at the core of modern molecular biology and relevant medical research. She is a member of the National Academy. Her scientific career began at Harvard, where Jim Watson enticed her into science first, apparently, Nobel Prize winner who solved the structure of the DNA helix. It continued at Harvard as a graduate student, where she investigated the role of the lambda repressor in regulating gene transcription, something that set up paradigms for gene regulation emerging decades afterwards. And then she returned to Jim Watson as a postdoc at Cold Spring Harbor by now. It was as an independent faculty member at the MIT Center for Cancer Research that many of us have come to know her. She was one of the founding members of the Cancer Center. She was also the only woman faculty at that time. And she did much to both establish and then cement the reputation of the Cancer Center, both with earlier research in RNA viruses, but then since then her groundbreaking work using genetic screens in zebrafish to identify cancer genes. And as I mentioned, Mary mentioned, she'll be giving a talk on that tomorrow at lunchtime. Which brings me to the reason we have Nancy here today. She's not just a great scientist, a great researcher, but she is a champion for the equal access to opportunities and resources for women in academia. both in terms of recruiting women faculty members, getting promotion, equal pay scales, recognition for their achievements, and again, both research, teaching, and otherwise. If you look around you in any of the teaching classes on campus, undergraduate classes, you'll notice how many women are in those classes. But then again, if you look at the top end of the university, tenured professors, deans of divisions, dare I say presidents, no, there's only one of those anyway. There's a huge difference, there's a huge gap, a chasm almost. And in the late 90s, Nancy at MIT, with a group of female colleagues, she led her colleagues to seek equality in those areas at MIT with the first MIT review of faculty diversity and unconscious gender bias at MIT. MIT, to their credit, took her comments on board, and what's very revealing and very reassuring is that in the update to that initial review, in the review of 2011, it's clear that Nancy's efforts and those of her colleagues have made a huge difference in terms of the numbers of tenured faculty that are women and deans, indeed, as she will, I'm sure, let you know. So she has changed how MIT operates. More importantly, she's changed how they think. It's been a true academic culture change at MIT, which I think, if you look back at the achievement of women in these areas, is almost is historical in terms of how it could influence things moving forward. So Nancy, we are honored, and thank you for coming, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say, and we will hopefully gain from your experiences.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. That was extraordinarily kind. Thank you. Really, very honored. And thank you. There you are. And all the people who met with me, the students and the postdocs and the busy administrators, and everyone's busy, and thank you for your time. So, title, here we are. It's true that for most of my adult life, I really did think of myself as simply a molecular biologist. But in 1995 and 96, I chaired a committee that looked into the status of women faculty in the 6 departments of science at MIT. And the committee made a long confidential report to the then Dean of Science, Bob Bergeneau. And 3 years later, in 1999, we published a short summary of the committee's findings in the MIT faculty newsletter. And that summary was called A Study on the Status of Women Faculty in Science at MIT. This story found its way to the front page of the New York Times, which is not where most faculty newsletters end up. Since then, I've been asked to give more talks about women in science than about science, leading me to a slight identity crisis. Furthermore, as a result of these events, in early 2000, I joined the MIT Central Administration and worked with the administration of Chuck Vest, MIT's then president, for 4 years to address the issues that were raised by the committee's report. So today I'm going to talk about what I learned about the issue of women in science over the past 15 years, how MIT has changed for women scientists, and it has really, I believe, changed enormously, and how far I think we still have to go if we want a faculty to reflect the numbers of women we train. I don't believe I will live long enough to have the faculty reflect the number of women in the population, nor would I have time to discuss such a possibility if I knew much about it. When I first provided this title for my talk, I thought I would limit myself to changes in the School of Science since 1999. But this year I had the occasion to take a longer and slightly broader view of this issue, and I found it very, very helpful for thinking about this problem. So I'm going to take that view today. Thus I have a new title, The Changing Status and Number of Women in Science and Engineering from 1901 to 2011. Longer and broader. So, one last comment before I begin. Although I am going to be talking primarily about MIT, based on my travels to many universities in the United States, I really believe that what I have to say about MIT is true of probably all research universities. I don't know particularly about this one, but I would be amazed if it were not the same here as well. And from what I hear, I think I could be just anywhere in the United States. So I limit myself to MIT because if you want to analyze this problem, you really need terrifically good institutional data. And if there's one thing MIT is good at, it's collecting data. So, and it's the data that I happen to have access to, and it really is what you need to have. So let me begin. So what I'm going to talk about then is an issue that has been talked about, written about, and studied to death, I think, for well over 30 years, namely the underrepresentation of women in STEM fields in the United States, particularly at the high end of these professions. I suspect there's not a person in the United States who has not heard of the leaky pipeline. Refers to the fact that talented women in science and engineering have traditionally left these fields at the higher rate than men at every stage of career, so by the time you get to the percent of women is very small. I think that it turns out if you want to understand this problem, you have to do two things. You need a detailed analysis of the numbers of women in science and engineering as a function of time in the institution and what caused those numbers to change. And then you have to look at the experiences of the women who first entered these fields as undergraduates, became graduate students, joined the faculty, and became full professors. And if you do these two things together, the mystery of the leaky pipeline actually begins to evaporate. And the story that emerges is, I think, actually pretty fascinating. Furthermore, although I'm going to talk about the slow advancement of women to the top of science and engineering fields, I think that much of what I have to say about the leaky pipeline of women in science and engineering pertains to the advancement of women in many other previously male-dominated occupations as well. It would probably surprise some of you to know that the percent of women on the science faculty of MIT today is greater than the percent of women in the United States Senate. If that doesn't distress you, it should. Okay, so I'll begin with some numbers that display the leaky pipeline using data collected by MIT's Office of Institutional Research. So here's the data from 1901 to 2011. This slide shows the percent of MIT undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty in science and engineering who are women. So today, about 45% of undergraduates who major in science and engineering at MIT are women. 29% of the graduate students are women, and 17% of the combined science and engineering faculty are women. So this is the drop-off that I mentioned that constitutes the leaky pipeline. 45 drops to 29, drops to 17. And of course, part of it is a time issue, but we know now that it's not just a question of time. When you look at this picture, you can see immediately that it can be divided into two distinct segments. For the first 60 or 70 decades, 60 or 70 years, starting from 1901, until the beginning of the mid-60s and early 70s, fewer than 5% of MIT undergraduates and PhD students were women, except during the two world wars. You notice those two bumps there. Men went away, so women were a higher percent of what was left behind. And during that first 1901, 7 decades, there were no women faculty in science and engineering. Then suddenly, the student curves began a dramatic rise in the late 1960s and early 70s, and the faculty curve begins to rise above zero and then to increase in the 1970s. So why is the graph divided in this fashion? The turning point was the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and subsequent affirmative action laws and the women's movement that altered people's thinking about the role of women in society. But why were there zero women on the science and engineering faculty before the 1960s? In fact, if you looked even further back, for the first 100 years of MIT's existence, you would find zero. After all, a few women got PhDs, as you can see, as early as the 1920s. I have to confess, I don't know the answer for MIT specifically. I was not there. However, when I first was given this graph by the wonderful people in the Lydia Snover in the Office of Institutional Research, I looked at it and I was immediately reminded of an anecdote from my graduate school days that I suspect supplies the answer. When I was a graduate student in the 1960s, I worked summers at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, where I met a woman scientist named Barbara McClintock. I was in my early 20s, and Barbara was in her late 60s. She was probably about my age that I am now, although in this picture, I think she's actually in her 80s, so I don't know how I look compared to that, but maybe the same. Well, anyway, one day, Barbara showed me a letter that had been written a number of years earlier, probably in the 1940s, to a biology department chair by a well-known geneticist. The chair was soliciting suggestions for candidates to fill a faculty opening in his department. The geneticist had offered several candidates' names and then added, "Of course, the #1 person in the world in this field is Barbara McClintock. It's too bad you can't hire her because she's a woman." Barbara told me she could not get a job, faculty job, in any university science department, only in home economics departments. Women simply could not get faculty jobs in science departments before the mid-1960s. Fortunately, Barbara managed to get a job as a research scientist at Cold Spring Harbor with support from the Carnegie Foundation. And as you know, at the age of 81, Barbara McClintock won the Nobel Prize in Medicine. So why do I tell you this ancient history? I mention this story because we are all totally confident that science is a meritocracy. And to a very large degree, it certainly is. But Barbara McClintock's story shows that societal beliefs can overpower merit. You could be the best in the world and still not be hired. So so now we look at this curve with renewed intelligence here. In 1964, it became illegal to deny women access to jobs based on their gender. In addition, the number of women in science and engineering majors began to climb nationally, as did the number of graduate students. Women began to be hired onto science and engineering faculties. People assumed, no, it's just a matter of time, and before the women will comprise half the faculty, as they comprise essentially half the students. But that was not what happened, as the next slide shows in greater detail for the women science faculty of MIT. So the previous slide showed the percent of women faculty in science and engineering combined, and what this slide shows is the absolute number of women faculty in the 6 departments of science as a function of time. So across the top, you can see the number of men in those same 6 departments at selected years. What you see here is that in 1960, there were no women faculty in the current departments at MIT. Women began to be hired in the mid-1960s, so by 1970, there were 2 women, 264 men. Then after 1971, the number of women shoots up by a factor of 10. So why is that? Why does the curve suddenly rise like that? 1971 saw the implementation of the affirmative action regulations under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the so-called Schultz regs, named after then U.S. Secretary of Labor George Shultz. The Schultz regs required universities to submit written plans to hire women and do so or risk losing their federal funding. Women were hired because the Civil Rights Act removed the barrier to their being hired, and then the federal law mandated it. So 64 was not sufficient to cause this to happen. It required the affirmative action laws to implement the 64 Act. I was approximately number 10 on that curve as it rises in 1973. I was superbly trained at Harvard and had done very visible research as a graduate student. I think if I'd been a man and applied for the job, I probably would have gotten it. But I hadn't even thought of applying for a faculty position. I was actively recruited by MIT and by Harvard for my credentials, I hope, I think, but I assume in part because it was the law. You'll notice that after this curve got up to about 20 women, hence 7 to 8% of the science faculty, it went flat as a pancake for 20 years. Interestingly, if you draw a graph of the number of women faculty in the School of Engineering at MIT, it's almost superimposable on this graph during this early period. It begins in 1964 with the hiring of 1 woman, and then it too shoots up in 73, 74 to reach 10 women faculty before plateauing for a decade. But first, a major conclusion from this historical view. What does this ancient history have to do with the leaky pipeline issues of today? Here's what I think it has to do with. If you look back, it's very obvious that not being able to get a job is a serious barrier to women's advancement. Equally clear is that the early 70s were a turning point that threw open the doors of universities and other workplaces for women. But what we did not know, I think what is not easy to see even today, and what has taken nearly 50 years to understand, is that on the other side of that 1964 wall were a series of obstacles to women's advancement that were unanticipated and essentially invisible. Furthermore, it's turned out, as we've learned more about it, that some of these obstacles were almost as effective as excluding women as the fact that a woman couldn't get a job at all. So how do you identify these invisible gender-based obstacles and remove them? Well, it turns out that to identify them and remove them takes about 30 years. When you realize there wasn't just one such obstacle but several, it's easy to see why the pipeline leaked and women's progress to the top has been so slow. So what were some of these major obstacles that have been identified and addressed? And I'm going to keep a running list of these, so by the end we'll have a full understanding of the leaky pipeline and we'll know how to fix it. Okay. Obstacle 1, could not be hired. Solution, Civil Rights Act, women's movement. Okay. So now we have to turn to the experiences of the women who were on the front of those waves of undergraduates and graduate students I showed you, some of whom became faculty. What were the experiences of these women who poured into the system in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s? Well, soon after, this I was around for. I wasn't around for the earlier part. I was around by this point. Soon after I arrived at MIT in 1973, I met a woman who had been hired by the president and chancellor of MIT at the request of a few women faculty who had arrived several years before me to deal with issues that were already affecting the first wave of female students and faculty. This woman, whose official title was ombudsperson, told me that the main issue she was grappling with was something I had never heard of. It was called sexual harassment. She told me that female students were having a difficult time dealing with professors who wanted to date them. Some of the professors were married. I did not understand immediately the seriousness of this problem, I have to confess. If they put men and women in the same place, in the workplace, what did they expect was going to happen? Nor did I think I had ever experienced sexual harassment as an undergraduate. It took me years to realize, maybe, perhaps I had, wasn't sure. For example, here's the kind of thing that happened of which we thought nothing at the time. I was an undergraduate at Harvard. I was sitting at my lab desk one day writing up notes. The door of the lab flew open. There stood a scientist I didn't know, but I recognized him instantly. Before I could rise, go to the door, and shake his hand, he had zoomed across the room, stood behind me, put his hands on my breast, and said, "What are you working on?" It was Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. Did I feel harassed? Absolutely not at all. Not at all. I was extremely embarrassed, but for him, I wasn't embarrassed for myself. My challenge was to figure out how to focus Crick's attention on my lab notebook without offending him. What I did not grasp until many years later was that a man who treats a student that way may not be genuinely interested in her lab notes. Why do I mention this ancient issue? Because I think it's so typical of this type of invisible barrier that women faced. Today, this particular barrier seems obvious to us, but at the time, to many of us, it was not at all obvious. And nor, by the way, were ombudspeople able to make a serious dent in fixing this problem. It took forward-looking people, particularly activist lawyers like Catherine McKinnon, the great feminist lawyer from Michigan, who established in court that sexual harassment constituted illegal gender discrimination under Title VII and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, because this behavior made it impossible for women to be equal in the workplace. So today, federal law requires that every workplace post a set of rules that prevent sexual harassment or institutions risk being sued. I should say that once sexual harassment became illegal at MIT, they appointed an associate provost, Jay Kaiser, to develop rules and implement their enforcement. From start to finish, it took 30 years to all but eliminate sexual harassment from classrooms and workplaces. And this time frame, as I've said before, is typical for most workplace barriers that women encountered, 30 years. And by the way, even after the problem was 98% solved, you couldn't repeal the law and throw away the rule book. You had to continue to enforce the rules. And if you don't think so, just ask Yale University. Well, you don't suppose that sexual harassment could have driven some young women from science, even though some were oblivious. It might have driven others away. I think it's pretty fair to say that some people were extremely negatively affected by this, and we can add it to the list, and it took the Supreme Court to solve this problem. So what happened to women as they went on to graduate school? And the answer to the next problem they encountered was a dearth of mentoring. When I was a graduate student, I had never heard of formal mentoring programs at Harvard. Presumably, mentoring happened as a matter of course when the students looked like the faculty. Or in the case of some women, like myself, the women were just lucky enough to find absolutely fabulous male mentors. Mine was Jim Watson, the co-discoverer with Francis Crick of the structure of DNA. Jim had a far more hands-off approach to mentoring. In fact, without Jim's support, I doubt, in fact, I'm certain I could never have become a scientist. I definitely owe my scientific career to Jim Watson, as well as the Civil Rights Act. But it turned out that many students did not find mentors, as I did and many other successful women did, and formal mentoring programs had to be devised and implemented. So we have added to the list a lack of a mentor who encourages you to believe in yourself and tells you you can become a scientist and helps you to do so is a critical part of young women's progress of every scientist, men and women. Everybody needs to have such a person. And by the way, although the women at the lead edge of the wave were the first to encounter these obstacles, women didn't leave them behind as they advanced to the next stage of their career. These barriers were cumulative. So sexual harassment wasn't just students, it applied to graduate students and even to faculty. Well, if you were a young woman and you were lucky enough not to be derailed by sexual harassment and you found a powerful male mentor who pushed you along, were you home free? Alas, no. During the transition from getting a PhD to joining the faculty was when young women were likely to encounter what I thought when I was young was the only barrier to women's advancement in science, and that was the infamous family work problem. When I was a student and a postdoc at Harvard, I noticed that there were almost no women on the science faculty, and I thought it was very obvious why not. I could see that high-level science, which was the only type I was interested in, required that you work 70-plus hours a week. The postdocs then were nearly all men. Many were already married with wives who stayed home to care for their children. How could you be the kind of scientist I aspired to be and be a mother? So I found a very good and simple solution to this problem. Well, simple. After obtaining my PhD and doing a postdoc, I got divorced. Just to be on the safe side, I decided not to remarry and not to have children. Took care of that problem. Well, now that you are experts in identifying invisible gender-related obstacles to women rising to the top, then you will realize that what most of us saw as a woman's choice to have children or not to have children was not much of a choice at all. Institutions in which high-level science was done were gendered. Men and women had different assigned roles. Men were expected to work night and day and support the family, and women were supposed to abandon their jobs and work full-time at home to support the man at work. And that was a system that was in place in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And in many ways, we're still grappling with the residue of this system today, even though it long ago ceased to reflect the reality of young people's lives today. Did women or did men really have a choice? And certainly it was not an equal choice. It didn't occur to many of us that this was a barrier that someone could or should remove on our behalf. I thought it was a biological reality and thus a woman's choice. So daunting was this particular obstacle that for decades women instinctively knew that at work we never should talk about pregnancy or children for fear that people would think we were not serious about science. You wanted to be sure that people knew you were thrilled to be a nun of science. And in fact, personally, I was. So I think, though, the question of whether having to decide to have children or not contributed to the leaky pipeline is just a rhetorical question. We know it did, and we know it still does. And studies by Marianne Mason and Mark Goulden at Berkeley have confirmed that having children causes women to leave the academic pipeline preferentially. And furthermore, it doesn't take very much to make it much less of an obstacle. So this is a barrier that we should put on the list and pay close attention to. So is that it? Were there any more barriers, or was that it for the women who wanted to be part of this fabulous, welcoming world of science and engineering, who weren't derailed by sexual harassment, who were lucky enough to find great mentors, who were willing to go having children, who found extraordinarily supportive husbands? There was one more issue, and it took many of us 20 years on the faculty to understand it. And I'm going to tell this story from a personal point of view because here I was involved with other women at MIT in identifying, I think, and addressing this obstacle. So like many women of my generation, I joined the faculty in 1973 really believing that the Civil Rights Act had solved whatever this thing was that was called gender discrimination. I certainly did not expect to experience it. I fled from feminists. Over the next 15 years, I found out I was wrong. I found that gender discrimination still existed. And the way I figured it out was by watching how other women were treated. And what I saw was very strange. I saw that when a woman and a man made scientific discoveries of equal importance, neither the woman nor her discovery was valued equally to the man's discovery or the man. Sometimes the woman got no credit at all. She was invisible. These observations were almost impossible to believe. I so strongly believed that science is a merit-based occupation, so how could it be true? But after years of watching through the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s how women faculty's contributions were treated relative to men's, I was certain that women and their science were undervalued. Interestingly, although it took me 15 years to be certain of it for other women, it took me 20 years to be certain it was actually true of me, too. Not just those other women. And that, by the way, is called denial. Some people advocate denial. They think that denial's a good thing. And it is in some ways, but not in others. Anyway, the realization of this strange truth was so demoralizing that I wanted to quit science, but I couldn't afford to, actually. And I came many times to feel that my life had really been a failure. I had cheerfully given up quite a lot to join this profession, which I truly passionately loved. But I came to realize and believe that no matter what I discovered, I would never really be accepted in this field. Worse, I believed I was the only person who had figured out this strange truth. I couldn't tell anybody because, first of all, who would believe you? And second of all, they would assume, as I always had, that if a woman complained of discrimination, it must mean you weren't good enough. If you were really good enough, if you discovered the structure of DNA, for example, they would have to give you the Nobel Prize, and you would be accepted as equal, right? Well, about that time, I read a book about Rosalind Franklin by a woman named Anne Sayre, and I finally realized that a woman could make a Nobel Prize level discovery and not necessarily receive the credit that might generally be accompanying such a discovery. I should say that last week I had an extraordinary experience of talking to a person who was part of that whole era when the structure of DNA was discovered. And he pointed out, as I mentioned today, that had Rosalind Franklin lived, he suspects what would have happened was that Maurice Wilkins would not have won the Nobel Prize because they couldn't give the prize to 4 people, and they would have had to give it to her if they gave it to one of the 2 of those people, but they couldn't give it to a woman because she was a woman. So that's how women were viewed in that era. In time, it dawned on me that the strange truth I discovered about women's science not being seen as equal when it was equal was probably the most important scientific discovery I'd actually ever made. It was so important, I actually thought it deserved a Nobel Prize. What I did not know, and would not learn for another decade, was the discovery I had made after 20 years of misery, long suffering, had already been made by somebody else. And furthermore, in 2002, a Nobel Prize was awarded for one version of this discovery. So what is it that had been discovered in this case, in the case of gender bias? It was psychologists and not biologists who had discovered the phenomenon in the 70s and the 80s by a series of very remarkable experiments. Their research demonstrated the irrationality of the human brain to make accurate judgments or see truths that contradict our conscious biases and beliefs. In the case of gender bias, the result of unconscious gender bias is to judge identical accomplishment as less good if we think it was done by a woman. For a related finding involving irrational decisions, the prize in economics went to the psychologist Kahneman. As for unconscious gender bias, another really surprising thing about it, I think unless you know about this work, is that the belief that women are less good than men persists whether the judges are men or women. Both women and men undervalue identical work done by a woman. So there are enormous consequences to this unconscious bias in the workplace. It can affect many aspects of the job, how a person is treated, their compensation, whether they're hired in the first place. And here's just one sort of typical example of the effect of unconscious bias from my era that relates to teaching. When I was a young professor, a colleague of mine asked me if I would teach a very important core course in our department with him. So I said, sure, that sounds like fun. He said he would go and ask the chairman to get his approval. A few days later, my colleague came back to say the chair had said no because, although he thought I was a good teacher, he knew that MIT undergraduates would not be able to believe scientific information spoken by a woman. I knew instantly the chair was right, and I was extremely grateful to him for sparing me from this potential disaster. What I find very odd today is that this knowledge did not open our eyes to the serious consequences of the unconscious undervaluation of women's competence in so many of their academic duties. I shrugged it off as simply the way the world was, and I happily continued to teach the undergraduate lab course that was taught almost exclusively by women faculty in that era. I simply didn't understand the consequences of that, and this, mind you, is something that you would deal with, of course, every single day that you went to work. So I think it's fair to say that unconscious bias and undervaluation of women's work surely has contributed vastly to the leaky pipeline over the years and to the failure to hire women unless novel efforts are made to see beyond our unconscious tendency to undervalue their accomplishments. Alas, I didn't know about this research, and I was struggling and having a very difficult time. I was very excited about some new work I was doing, and despite being a tenured professor, I couldn't get some minimal space and resources I needed and that I noticed everybody else had. So I decided I'd take my case up through the MIT administration till I found someone who would listen to me. But happily, along the way, I decided to muster up the courage to tell one of my female colleagues what I'd learned. And I chose Mary Lou Pardue, a biologist that I admired very much for her wisdom and her scientific accomplishments. We sat down to lunch. I had written a letter to the president of MIT explaining about gender discrimination. I thought I'd just better run it by somebody before I shipped it out. To my absolute amazement, she read the letter, got to the bottom of the page, put it down on the table and said, well, I agree with everything here. I thought, whoa, that's amazing. She had discovered exactly what I had discovered. So we looked at each other and said, you don't suppose other people could have figured this out, do you? So we decided what we would do was go and check out the tenured women faculty in the 6 departments of science so we could ask them. And that was when we made the extraordinary discovery that in 1994, there were 15 tenured women and 197 tenured men. I said, check the back of the catalog. Possibly they list them separately. We found 2 women in the School of Engineering who had joint appointments to science. We added them to increase our numbers to 17. And it was very easy to poll them, and 16 of the 17 women, within a very short time, a week or less, signed a letter to the Dean of Science saying there was systemic and largely invisible and almost certainly unconscious bias against women faculty. We asked him to convene a committee to document the problem so he could fix it. Lucky Bob Birgeneau. Well, the committee was formed in 1995 and essentially operated secretly because none of these women wanted to be seen as feminists. In fact, to have that many women meet in one room at MIT was so unusual that we were afraid to be seen meeting on the campus. We had to find places where nobody would see that many women going into a room. It was sure to arouse suspicion. The committee interviewed all the tenured and most of the untenured women faculty and collected data. What we found was that women came in believing that gender discrimination had been solved in some previous generation, but as they progressed through their careers from junior faculty to tenured professors, they gradually were marginalized from full inclusion in the process. And it turns out that marginalization has serious consequences. You're excluded from access to resources and professional activities, rewards, compensations that make MIT the superb and envied environment in which to do science that it truly is. And this job made, of course, the jobs much more difficult and less gratifying. The women, of course, also noted the incredibly small number of women on the faculty, 8% that 15 years ago. They suggested that the negative experiences that some of them have had, many of them, could even contribute to these small numbers. Because female students often said to them, I don't want to be like you. As one woman remarked, who could blame them? I don't want to be like me either. And the word that came to summarize this gradual experience of the women as they aged was marginalization. So add it to the list. So in response to this report, then Dean of Science Bob Birgeneau immediately corrected all the inequities that he could that were reported in this report, and he recruited women immediately into administrative roles in science, such as creating associate department head roles and so forth. And importantly, he said, the answer to this problem is more women. And he quickly identified top women scientists, then at MIT, around the country, got as many names as he could, and he went after them. He went on a recruiting binge. And so if you look at this curve, you see that after the plateau, there's a sudden sharp rise that occurs very quickly, and that is the direct result of the efforts of Dean Birgeneau. So we call this the Birgeneau bump. And of course, the women in science who had brought this to his attention were thrilled because immediate problems had been solved. Things were already amazingly different. We were thrilled. Of course, we knew if Bob Birgeneau left, things would go right back to square one, but that was not what happened. In 1999, the chair of the MIT faculty was a woman named Lottie Balin, who was a professor in the Sloan School. And she knew about the work of the committee, and it was she who asked me to write a summary of our findings for the faculty newsletter. And as I told you, it ended up on the New York Times. And I have to say the reaction completely overwhelmed us. Doug Vest received hundreds of emails a day. I mean, it was crazy. And I think there were 2 reasons why that report had the impact it had, besides the fact that, of course, it articulated an apparently near universal workplace issue for many, many women. Most important, the president of MIT, Charles Vest, had read that report, believed it was true, and chose to endorse it publicly at a time when most institutions denied or suppressed similar claims by women faculty. What he wrote was, I've always believed that contemporary gender discrimination within universities is part reality, part perception, true, but I now understand reality is by far the greater part of the balance. And this was a very courageous thing to do in 1999. This is a good man. I believe the second reason the report had an impact, and a major reason that Vest wanted to endorse it, was because of the scientific stature of the women who had documented discrimination. And this slide shows some of the accomplishments of the 16 women who first wrote to Dean Bergenow in 1994 to tell him that they thought there was systemic discrimination. Today, 3 of those 16 women have won the United States National Medal of Science, and nearly 70% are members of the National Academy of Science. When someone complains of discrimination, it's often assumed or said they aren't good enough, but it's very hard to say that about these particular women. Incidentally, many of these women were hired in the 1970s as a result of the Schultz regs. In other words, most of these were affirmative action hires. So after so much publicity, MIT was on the hot seat, let's be honest, to find long-term solutions to these problems the women had discovered. So the first thing it did was to replicate the studies in all the other parts of MIT. In the School of Engineering, Professor Lorna Gibson chaired a committee that obtained almost identical results to those in science. The Dean of Engineering at the time, Tom Magnanti, quickly stepped in as Bob Bergenow had and fixed all the inequities immediately, and set about also to hire more women by devising highly innovative recruiting methods and search procedures. And the effort was remarkably successful, as I'll show you in a moment. But how do you really fix these issues long-term and embed the solutions in the policies and practices and cultures of an institution? Because these are really, truly non-trivial problems. Here's this list again. We have no women faculty in the academic. There'd never been a female department head in science or engineering. We found the marginalization resulted in unequal access to resources and rewards. That women couldn't have children and have a family. You couldn't talk about having children. Women were afraid to take a family leave policy because of the stigma attached to it. There was numbers of women hadn't changed, marginalization and undervaluation. So the approach MIT took to this was to appoint women who had worked on the issue into the central administration to work with the powerful administrators, the president, the provost, and deans, with the authority those men had the authority to write new policies for family leave, to track equity for women faculty, and to fix inequities, to monitor fairness in hiring, and so forth. And so in this picture, the white boxes show the sort of power structure, if you like, of MIT, the president and the provost and 5 deans, and underneath the deans are generally the department heads, not shown here. And the gray boxes are sort of artificial parallel administration, temporary administration that was established under President Vest of women faculty who worked with the deans, with the provost, and with each other to address these problems so that the problems could be brought right away to the people who had the power to actually fix them. And I was appointed to work with Provost Bob Brown, who's now the president of BU, on this issue. And with time, I should say that this structure has evolved in a way which is very interesting, as in fact, some of these positions have become occupied by women. And so these committees have really sort of dissolved away. The president of MIT is now a woman. 2 of the 5 deans of MIT are now women. And these, my position was upgraded to an associate provost who works on this issue for MIT. And then there's an associate dean of science and associate dean of engineering who work on these issues with the deans of science and engineering. And these are some of the solutions that have been put in place. Equity is checked annually. I think it's fair to say that it's equitable. Most important, new family leave policies, babies everywhere, talk about babies, take leave of absence, still get tenure, all kinds of stuff. Unimaginable in our lifetime, my day. Build a daycare center smack in the middle of the busiest part of campus. Men push carriages of babies, women push babies. Recruit women, babies. We never said that 4-letter word in MIT until recently. Recruit women to the administration, recruit more women faculty, and make sure department heads are inclusive of women. So, of course, one asks again, when you make this effort, what about the quality of the numbers and so forth? Well, here are the numbers. There's, again, Bob Bergenow made the curve jump. Bob Bergenow left MIT. The curve went flat. Dean Kastner came in, appointed Hazel Siv as associate provost. Curve jumped up again. So that's the science curve. And so now we've had 3 affirmative efforts to increase the number of women. So what happened to the quality? It's holding up. These are the MIT professors of science who are members of the National Academy. Men, 31%, women, 40%. Now, I do not mean to imply for one moment that the men are not as good as the women. No. This number is too small to be significantly different. But all I want to say is that the women who have been hired as a result of these special efforts are holding up their end of the bargain. And in engineering, similarly, women faculty in engineering, the rise in women from 10 to 16% from 2002 to 11 has been the work of Tom Magnanti, followed by Dean Subra Suresh, who's now the head of the NSF. Terrific guy, by the way, so this is a wonderful thing. And again, these women have also have turned out to be highly successful. I mean, frankly, when you bring people into great institutions like the University of Chicago and MIT, they do well. It isn't, so you find the right people, bring them in, and they do well. So this is terrific. So there's really tremendous progress. There are many women in the MIT administration versus 0 when we began. There are more than twice as many women on the faculty. Equity is reviewed on a continuous basis. It's routine for women to take family leave. And most important of all, these changes have made MIT a more welcoming place for women. But is that really true? So this year we decided the way to find out was to go and ask them. Have to go and ask them. And so all the women faculty in science and engineering were re-interviewed this year. And they were divided into 3 groups: women who participated in these studies a decade ago, the original studies, the women who have received tenure since that time, and the junior women faculty. And the results were reported in a report about a month ago, and this committees were chaired by Hazel Siv in the School of Science and by Lorna Gibson and Barbara Liskoff in the School of Engineering. And the results show truly remarkable change, because I think that I've talked about many of the things that have made such a difference. And I think women of my generation are the ones who are probably the most amazed by it all, because the change is so dramatic. But the really good news is that the women who come after us really love MIT and feel privileged and excited to work at MIT, as they should. And here are just a few quotes that were picked as being representative of these interviews. Senior women faculty: who would have thought it possible in our lifetime? That is true. Tenured women faculty who came after us, younger tenured women faculty: MIT has given me a platform for recognition. It's a fabulous place to work. It's not warm and fuzzy, but enabling. Love that. And junior women faculty: this place is full of energy and a great place to be junior. And this overall thing was positive. So, can we finish? Is it over? Have we done? All solved? Well, if you've been listening to this talk, I hope I've convinced you that that would not be possible, because we know that it takes 30 years to remove one barrier that's hindered the advancement, and years of monitoring after that, and MIT is only 12 to 15 years into this effort to fix the problems that were identified by senior women faculty. So we know that these efforts would have to continue for at least 15 more years. And indeed, the new reports found that problems persist. So what are the problems? Problems that remain that we learned about will be familiar to probably many of you. Some are lesser problems, lesser versions of old problems. For example, today, women teach undergraduate core courses. They get extremely good evaluations, but some women report that they still believe that some students have less respect for women faculty than for men faculty, and it's probably true. Some are new problems that arise from changes in society. For example, the 2-career couple. In my generation, you followed your husband and hoped for the best. And today, both people in a relationship expect to continue their careers. So this is really a new problem that all universities are facing. Then we have problems that were reported this year in the new report that actually arise from solutions that were designed to address earlier issues. So, for example, women felt excluded. Department heads were told to make sure to include them. So these poor women, who have still very small numbers, have to serve on every committee. So they're exhausted. They're running from committee to committee and torn in 1,000 directions. So we realized and it's very important that you have that women be on committees that are important committees, but it's just too much work. So when you have small numbers like that, that's an issue we have to find a different solution for. But as the final topic that I'd like to address is one problem that emerged from interviews with all 3 age groups of women faculty, and that also resulted from these efforts, and at the same time may also be the same reason that you need these efforts. Indeed, we've heard about this problem from our female postdocs, our graduate students, and even female undergraduates. The issue is the perception that when women advance, they must have done so through some unfair advantage or lowering of the standards, when they were hired, when they got tenure, when they win prizes, and the negative impact that this false perception can have on women's confidence. We need a new vocabulary because we know now that there are two kinds of affirmative action. One was designed decades ago to increase diversity by temporarily lowering requirements for certain jobs and schools. That kind of affirmative action is actually illegal now. And furthermore, it has never existed in faculty recruitment at MIT, except possibly in that era when only men could be hired. Instead, as I've discussed, a second type of affirmative action was needed. First, to end the prohibition against hiring women, and then to recruit exceptional female candidates. Why does it take special effort, different effort, to hire women if they're really just as good as men? Why doesn't it just happen on its own with the passage of time? As more women students have come in, couldn't we just sit and wait? And why doesn't this just happen by itself? It does not. Why is that? Well, first, because there are fewer women in the pipeline, so it's more work to find them. Second, because we know now we can overlook women since we can undervalue them even when they are as good as male candidates. And also because for a variety of reasons, women may not apply unless they are asked. Why does it bother women to have people insinuate that they were hired because of affirmative action? And does it matter? This is a study we don't have to do. The psychologists have beaten us to it again. It's been done and done and done. It turns out, this is fascinating. You tell a man he was hired because of affirmative action and he says, so what? I'm the best person for the job. Tell a woman the same thing and it seriously undermines her self-confidence. Why is this? What's the difference? Psychologists believe that both men and women suffer the unconscious bias that women really are less good than men, and hinting that women were hired because of affirmative action reinforces this unfounded, unconscious, and destructive bias. But why would anyone believe that women who get tenure at MIT are less good than men, particularly when the data clearly show it isn't true? Where does this belief come from? To answer a question that difficult, you have to go to Harvard and ask that brilliant economist, university administrator, and my good friend, Larry Summers. His hypothesis that women have less intrinsic aptitude for science and math and engineering fields was a stunning public declamation of where the problem comes from. It comes from the society around us. There is not a shred of credible scientific evidence that any group of people is intrinsically, i.e. genetically inferior in any intellectual activity required for science and engineering, least of all women, and not for lack of effort and research to find the answer. This is not a scientific belief, but a bias, and I think it's not unreasonable to ask whether promulgating a belief in the genetic inferiority of women, or of any group, in schools or workplaces should, like sexual harassment, be illegal under Title VII and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, because it creates and reinforces an unequal playing field. You cannot operate equally in a workplace if people believe that you, as a group, are inferior. Very difficult. So it's this unfounded and unconscious bias itself that needs to change, both men and women's undervaluation of women and the women's undervaluation of themselves. So we have to keep attacking this problem because we find that even freshman women today ask us, how should I deal with male classmates who tell me I only got into MIT because of affirmative action? These young women tell us this attitude began in high school. Just last week, there appeared in the MIT student newspaper an article by an MIT student in response to the new report about women faculty. What does he suggest? He suggests we entertain the belief that the reason for the skewed gender ratios in science and engineering faculties is due to something simple, namely, quote, there are simply more smart men than smart women. So our students still, some of them, hold this belief. Of course, there was an opposing view by another student saying it wasn't true, which was hopeful. Anyway, we know this contributes to the problem. So I think in closing, I'd like to say that I think we really do understand quite well the leaky pipeline, the underrepresentation of women at the top of science and engineering fields. And I think it's likely that just as we can look back and wonder at the people who couldn't hire Barbara McClintock, people will look back on this era and say, what were those people thinking? And they might even laugh at us, as a young woman did recently to me. I was talking to an editor at Nature magazine. She was talking about an article on this topic, and I said to her, if you wanted to attract women to science, would you have designed the system we have now? She burst out laughing. She literally burst out laughing. So indeed, I think that the Civil Rights Act opened the doors to women, but they were invited to run a highly competitive race essentially on one foot. So we need to turn things upside down and take the attitude, not how grateful people should be to be allowed in, but how do we, what do we still need to do to ensure the full inclusion and full participation of the most talented, most qualified people, regardless of gender. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. That was fabulous, funny, and informative, and great. I'm sure there are many questions. I see one lady in yellow. I'll pass the mic.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. I thought you might be interested to hear about implementation of some of what you talked about. I'm a local U of C product of 1961, PhD chemistry. For one thing, I never put my name, which is Susan, on any publication. It has been S.V. And that, maybe this is paranoid, but it has worked. Not on any research paper. Number two, about job requirements. It is just getting more sophisticated. I don't think that we solved too many problems. For example, 5 years ago, this is a major research institution in Illinois. They put in an advertisement that the person should be in inorganic polymer chemistry. And those of you know that inorganic polymer is something like 1% of the total. And a person also had to have a Native American background. Now, that means that they could tell the government they weren't able to find anybody to fill the requirements for this job. Very simple. They could go and get the funds and not obey. So now that's number two. And number three, about sex discrimination. I don't know if you would call it that, but when I started here as a brand new foreign student in 1957, it was traditional for years for the students to play a prank on the few graduate student women. There were only 4 of us in that class. And that was in this building to send the girl for a bottle of hydrochloric acid into the solution room. Now, what none of us knew is that in order to get the hydrochloric acid, you had to go through the men's room. And very fortunately, I had sort of a big brother Canadian, a guy who acted like big brother to me and tipped me off. So when they sent me to get the hydrochloric acid, I started singing on top of my lungs, and that gave the guys a chance to cover up. So they didn't get the girlish giggle from me as they were expecting, so they were very disappointed. But this might constitute today as some kind of a harassment, even though nobody put a hand on me in any way. And last but not least, the intrinsically inferior genetically problem, I think it's much more existing in the United States than anywhere else.
You're the 4th person who said that today.
Yes.
This is really interesting.
I taught non-science majors for 24 years. By the way, I never made it to any kind of top. I have children, and I divided my career. I taught for 24 years, and my youngest was out of high school. I went back to research, which is where I've been. But there was no way to do the two together. Anyway, on any conference that I've ever gone to, there were women from England, there were women from France, women from Italy. I have good relationship with them, and they didn't have the same kind of problems. That is mainly because the system is different. They have 3 weeks holiday at Christmas, and the men go also just like the women, and they don't have our kind of tenure system. Between 25 and 40, very few women who are married and have children are compatible with the guys. The United States system, you have to make it in 7 years or you're out. In Europe, this is integrated, pardon me for the math terminology, integrated over a lifetime. So I think that is one of the problems that you were mentioning. It is our American system. And also we have girls who still think that it's a chic not to be able to balance the checkbook. And it is not feminine to show up in a class equally good to the guys. Because God Almighty, they're not going to get dates. And this is 5-6 years ago. Not this year, but 5-6 years ago. So we still have some things to solve.
I agree. That's very interesting.
Okay.
I have a question related to what you mentioned about women not being valued in the classrooms, and that whenever they say they are not taken as seriously. At our institution, we try to address this problem. We have many faculty who have experienced similar problem. We try to have something what we call the first lectures, which we give a lecture to the incoming students, just explaining the situation and trying to point out some of the issues that's involved and making sure that the women are being introduced and valued that way. But there's a drawback though, if the woman have to have a man to go to their classroom to establish the woman's status as a scientist, and that's a double sword. I'm just wondering whether or not MIT have done anything in related to this, and if there's anything people can do to address that issue.
They have done things to educate, help department heads understand the issue as it pertains to hiring women and the impact on letters and all of that kind of thing. But nothing's been done about educating students, and I've been sort of interested in the question of whether or not one could develop a course, particularly a place like MIT, that could somehow grow out of neuroscience, and yet, I found it to be I found this whole literature to be just totally fascinating. Whether it should be almost a required course, or a module, some short thing because what could be more important to learn about than this? I can't think of many things, but I haven't been able to figure out how you would do it in a very intellectual kind of way that would make it an interesting thing for students. Somebody has some ideas on this. I'd love to hear about them. I went to a conference that was people who teach introductory biology, and some of them got very interested in the possibility of trying to figure out how to develop a module that could be used in a biology class, essentially. Because it's an aspect of mind, really, and it's fascinating and really important to know.
I was fascinated by your first slide that was a graph of the numbers, a function of time at MIT. I was at MIT as an undergraduate back in the dark ages when all of 2% of the students were women. Back before there were any faculty women at MIT. And all I can say is congratulations on your accomplishments so far, and keep up the good work. Oh, and I'd love to have a copy of that slide.
You got it. That's great.
I'm faculty here, and I have one concern that, I love your talk. I love what you've done. Everybody's grateful. There's one thing, though, that keeps coming out when people talk about women in science that grates on me, and that's the emphasis on mentorship. And I don't disagree with the fact that mentorship is important. But for the vast majority of women, they're not going to get it. And if we go around telling them you can't succeed without a mentor, it makes them feel that if they don't have a good situation, that they won't get through. And I think most women who are at the top right now did not have a great situation. And if we go to the young women now and say, well, you're lost without a mentor. If you don't have this warm, fuzzy feeling and people holding your hand and telling you you're wonderful, you'll just never cut it. Then we do them a disservice. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it among ourselves. But to go and publicly say, without a mentor, you can't make it, that's not true.
And I think you're absolutely right. And if I said it too strongly, you're absolutely correct. I think it certainly has always helped, men also in their careers. The mentors were always important. They can really help your career, but not everybody had one.
Yeah.
And you can make it by any means. There's every conceivable way. Determination and stick-to-itiveness is absolutely. Thank you. I agree.
Margaret.
Oh, can't have looked that man there.
Oh,
Oh, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if you've come up with a good word for the second version of affirmative action, because actually the new New York Times article that was on the report, your new report, I read it as if MIT had done the old version of affirmative action, and it started a huge argument between my mother and I. So do you have a good word to call it in terms of?
Affirmative effort? I don't know. I mean, it's a real problem.
It
It's
is.
a real problem. And there was a great debate in these interviews with the women. Some people think you should never talk about this because then the problem would go away. But what we know is you stop talking about it,
It
you
goes
stop
back.
hiring women. I mean,
Yep.
when you take your attention off it, it stops. So you've got to, I'm not sure if it's one of these cases where you're just going to have to keep trying to educate people and barrel ahead. I think, it is terribly unfair. You can't hire, and that's another thing I think people don't realize. You never hire somebody who doesn't come out the top person in the search. You just never do. It's just that you have to look very hard to find really quirky, unusual, odd people, which is who we're hiring anyway, right? That's what we're trying to find.
If the reporter was writing that article
As if-
bad version
as if it was the bad.
that happened, and all the administration from MIT was trying to correct it, but
It didn't come across. And that reporter is fabulous.
Nancy, I had a question. Obviously, MIT has done a great job. The question is, to what extent other institutions have followed suit? Obviously, each university's got its own structure, and so the approach that MIT took of putting in place this kind of shadow administration might not always work at other institutions. And I was curious if you knew how other institutions have done and how the structure thing could be solved.
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it's very institution specific. I know this advanced program, which I think is fabulous, absolutely fabulous, has allowed each institution to develop its way of doing it for that institution. So Michigan, which has had this wonderful program with Abby Stewart, I think that's really phenomenal, and I think she's done a phenomenal job. I think at the time it started, we thought about, I'm not sure you could have done that at MIT at that time. Institutions are different, and you have to kind of tune it. But what I see when I go around, some of them are fabulous, and some of them, honestly, you can't believe it's still the same as ever. It's just unchanged. I mean, some of them haven't changed at all, and some of them have really changed. Some have done better than MIT. Some have done worse. There's everything. I think that on average, I think they're, all moving along, and the numbers tend to come together. So, and it puts pressure on each other. I mean, one of the things that came out of also the Chuck Vest when we were doing the early work was getting presidents of 8 other research universities to come to MIT. He invited them, and they came with other women from their institution and all sort of committed to doing them, went back and did studies in their own places, and then continued to meet each year with a new topic. So it kind of spread through that group. And this was before advance had been really spread. So that was another thing. So I think, it's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time, and I can see, I mean, that's why I think, the great institutions have to lead on this, because it is so much work, and it does take a lot of time and resources, and some places just don't have enough, effort available to do it. So if the rich institutions can't do it, then they're the ones who have to lead on this, I think.
I'm Martha McClintock. I am the intellectual granddaughter of Barbara McClintock. No genetic relationship that I know of. But she was my teacher's teacher. So
Really?
Anyway, yes. So I'm on the faculty here. There are 2 issues that I don't think you quite touched on that strike me here at the University of Chicago. One is the ability or right, if you will, for women to be as successful as men when they are as mediocre as men. In other words, the focus is on the tails of the distribution, the looking for affirmative action, getting the best. So you pull in at MIT, which is great, those that are in the National Academies, plural. But what about your ordinary, good enough, federally funded scientist, engineer, teaching at a decent university, being able to be on parity with space, as you've so elegantly shown at MIT, but also cachet, also salary, all these things, not when you're off the curve successful, but when you're right smack in the middle of the bell curve. And I think if you were to look at those data, it's pretty appalling. Even more appalling. And that's a harder problem to address. So that's sort of the
You know, what do you women want anyway? The right to be as successful as a man is when we're as mediocre as that man is, you know, if you see what I mean. The second thing is, I think the other area that really needs help is institutional support for women once they are full professors. And again, that is the right to be as irresponsible and eccentric as their male colleagues are. Like, we earned it, we're full professors, can we please let our guard down? So I just put that out there as two areas with which I have experience, either by observation or participation, and say, until those are solved, I think we still have a major problem at the level, you know, women faculty. And when I think the undergraduates and the graduate students see that problem solved, that will be the major source of encouragement. Not that, oh yeah, there are a few superstars running around who, gee, I'll never be one of them. So, food for thought.
I think I'm not sure how we feel about time here. We have one more question. We have a reception afterwards, so lots of people can meet with Nancy then for other questions. One more question.
That was a great comment, by the way, and I've heard it from a number of people, and I think that part of the reason that the women have to be so good is because they are undervalued, and if they weren't that good, they wouldn't even be equal. They wouldn't be seen as equally good. That's the problem.
So I have a sinking feeling I've been chosen for the last question because of my gender. But my question, yeah. So what really stood out to me as the crux of all of this is the unconscious bias that you mentioned. And I was wondering if there's anything else that's been studied, you know, sort of away from sexism, racism, any sort of bias like that, but of a sort of society-held belief, unconscious or not, that has fundamentally shifted. And I'm wondering what was the time scale of that shift and what sort of caused that shift, and is creating these, addressing things institutionally, you mentioned funding within labs, addressing that institutionally, is it enough to do that and then wait and hope that the bias shifts itself?
Are there psychologists in the room who know?
Yeah.
Such a great question.
Along the question that you raised, I was just at a conference a week ago, and it was approaching biosafety from a human behaviorist perspective. And one of the things that he used as an example was that trying to change human behavior, you couldn't do the paradigm of set it up and they will follow. He used the example of instituting the use of latex gloves when you go to the dentist office. Everybody was resistant to that. It kind of had to be mandated from the top. And then there was a time period where people were kind of uncomfortable with that. And now you come to a generation where, oh my gosh, are you kidding? You're not putting your hands in my mouth without latex gloves. Same with seat belts, same with other things that have societal shifts. And so those are regulated.
That's fascinating. I might say two things. I mean, one is, yes, there's that old saying from the Revolutionary era, but change the institution and the hearts and the minds will follow. You can't change people's hearts and minds one by one. You take forever, you'll never get anywhere. You have to change the institution, and people think, oh, we didn't know us do it that way. But the other thing I find is, I don't know the answer, and it's a really great question. The thing that I think is really interesting, there's a person named Masrin Banaji who studies this. Many of you may know, a psychologist at Harvard. And one of the things they try to understand is, at what age do people acquire these biases? And is there anything you can do to change them? And they acquire them, brace yourself, between the age of 3 and 9 months. Is when they start to acquire these biases. And they're trying to figure out ways in which you can actually show them pictures and so forth that will, and finding things that can impact how they look at things. But I think, if you look at the studies that they've done, where you say compare a paper written, the same identical paper written by, and put a man's name or a woman's name, you send it out for review, and people think the man's paper is better even though they're identical. The difference has gotten lesser over time. So society is shifting. And how it happens, I don't really know. Revolution, I guess. I mean, it doesn't just happen. It happens because somebody did something. It doesn't just happen. That's what I've learned from all of this. Time alone does not fix anything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy.